Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take, well, a really dense stack of material and give you the key insights, without the hours of reading. Today, we are wading into some pretty deep waters, U.S. foreign policy and specifically the U.S.-Israel special relationship. Our mission, just to be clear, is to objectively look at the evidence presented in our sources about the sheer scope of American support and the influence of the organized lobby in shaping some really crucial U.S. decisions.
Yeah, and this material, it's not meant to be, let's say, comfortable. I mean, the academic essay that really kicked a lot of this off, the one we looked at closely, it was described by Michael Massing in the New York Review of Books as having, and I quote, detonated with such force when it was published. Exactly. So for you listening, we have to stress this. We're acting strictly as impartial reporters here. We're here to examine the financial, diplomatic, strategic, and yes, the moral arguments laid out in these sources, and just report those findings back to you.
Precisely. We're just following the information where it leads us. So, okay, let's unpack this. Maybe starting with the sheer scale, the hard numbers defining this relationship. How big are we talking, money and diplomatic cover?
Well, the financial scale is pretty striking. The sources we reviewed show Israel as the largest annual recipient of U.S. foreign aid basically since 1976.
Since 1976. That's almost 50 years at the top of the list. That timeline alone says a lot.
It really does. And the raw dollars, you're looking at roughly $3 billion in direct foreign assistance annually.
$3 billion. And that single amount, the sources say, makes up about 1/6 of America's entire direct foreign aid budget worldwide.
Right. But maybe the best way to grasp the magnitude is per person. The material points out this direct aid comes out to over $500 a year for every single Israeli citizen. Over
$500 per person. And how does that compare?
We'll compare that to, say, Egypt, the next biggest recipient mentioned in that period. They get about $20 per person. Or Pakistan, around $5 per person. It's a huge difference.
And what really jumps out here, and the analysts keep hitting this point, is the anomaly of it all. Israel is described as an affluent, modern industrial power. It ranked 29th globally in per capita income back in 2006, according to the data cited.
Right.
So the question raised is, why is the U.S. giving this, massive level of aid to a clearly robust economy, especially when it dwarfs support for countries that are genuinely impoverished?
It definitely challenges the standard logic for foreign aid. And then beyond the money, there's the diplomatic support, which the sources describe as, well, virtually absolute.
Absolute.
Get this. Between 1972 and 2006, the U.S. vetoed 42 UN Security Council resolutions critical of Israel.
42. Just, wow. That number alone shows a level of commitment that seems, unique. Almost like U.S. policy at the UN takes its cues directly from Israeli objectives sometimes.
It's more than the combined total of vetoes cast by all other Security Council members during that same period. But here's where it gets really interesting, according to the analysis. The paradox of leverage. Maybe the lack of it. This vast U.S. support, the material reveals, very rarely translated into actual leverage over Israeli policy.
That just seems completely backwards.
Yeah.
If you're the one footing the bill and providing the diplomatic shield, shouldn't you have some say? Shouldn't you be able to call the shot sometimes?
Logic would say yes. But the pattern laid out in these sources shows U.S. leaders usually had to offer additional parrots, more assistance, rather than using sticks or threatening to withhold aid.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The sources mention Israel agreeing to endorse UN Resolution 242, the foundational land for peace idea, but only after President Nixon apparently gave private assurances of getting them additional U.S. aircraft. So the aid often seems like a baseline requirement, not really a tool for pushing concessions.
That failure to translate aid into leverage, it leads us right to the core argument in these sources, doesn't it? That the real power center maybe isn't in Jerusalem, but right here in Washington, D.C.
Exactly.
So let's pivot to that political dimension, because the material argues the real engine driving U.S. policy is domestic politics, specifically the organized efforts known as the Israel Lobby.
Indeed. And the sources point to, for example, a 2005 National Journal study. It placed AIPAC, that's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, as the second most powerful lobby in Washington, tied with the AARP.
Tied with the AARP.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary clout for a group focused primarily on just one foreign relationship.
It really is. And that influence, the sources argue, is backed by significant financial weight in elections. If you look at the period between 1990 and 2004,
Okay.
pro-Israel political action committees, or PACs, contributed nearly $57 million to candidates and parties.
57 million. And how does that compare to, say, groups on the other side of the issue?
Well, during that same time frame, the sources state that Arab American and Muslim PACs contributed just under $800,000.
Wow. $57 million versus $800,000. That's a massive disparity.
It creates huge pressure, especially, in tight races.
You can see how that would make voting against the lobby's line feel, well, risky, which explains why it's widely seen as politically suicidal for members of Congress. It leads to these really candid, almost startling quotes the sources pull out.
Like Senator Ernest Hollings.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
In 2004, he just said it plainly. You can't have an Israeli policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here.
And this political culture, this expectation of unwavering support, it shows up across the board, particularly with high-profile candidates. The sources cite the 2008 election cycle.
Right, I remember reading about that.
You had John Edwards saying, "Your future is our future," Hillary Clinton calling Israel a beacon of what's right. Seems like conformity is basically a political requirement.
And critically, this conformity isn't just external pressure. It's also enforced internally, isn't it? The discussion points to this powerful norm within major American Jewish organizations.
Right, the idea that American Jews should stand publicly united with Israel and air disputes only in private.
So any group that actually challenges Israeli government policy publicly.
Like the group Brera back in the 1970s, they faced a severe backlash. They were effectively marginalized, the sources say, to maintain that united front.
Okay, so we've got massive financial and diplomatic backing, check, and intense, well-funded domestic political organization, check. The next big question the sources tackle is, does this whole setup actually serve U.S. strategic interests?
And here the argument presented is pretty stark. They argue that this unconditional support has, in fact, become a strategic liability.
That completely flips the script from the Cold War era, right?
Yeah.
Back then, the worry was that embracing Israel would hurt U.S. ties in the region. Are the sources basically saying that original rationale containing the Soviets is gone and the justification is shifted?
Precisely. Post-Cold War, the argument goes, the strategic value went down while the costs went way up. And the most painful cost cited is the direct link to anti-American extremism.
Okay, how direct?
Well, the authors highlight the 9/11 Commission findings. They confirm that Osama bin Laden was motivated by Israel's behavior and, crucially, by U.S. support for Israel.
That's a heavy claim. That U.S. policy on this one issue directly fuels threats against Americans.
It creates a fundamental problem for America's image in the region, the sources argue. They noted bin Laden even tried to speed up the 9/11 attacks after Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount in 2000. It just shows how central the Palestinian issue is in shaping how the U.S. is seen, often as biased or callous.
And beyond fueling hostility, the sources also bring up times when Israel itself acted against U.S. interests. I think you mentioned technology transfers earlier.
Yes, exactly. The material we looked at points to examples of Israel allegedly transferring American technology to other countries. And the most visible example of this tension, they claim, is the Jonathan Pollard espionage case.
Right, where U.S. military intelligence was compromised.
Yeah. They frame Pollard as maybe just the tip of a larger iceberg. It demonstrates that, for all the support the U.S. provides, it's not always an alliance of perfectly aligned interests.
Okay, let's drill down into some specific policy cases. The sources are very direct about the lobby's alleged influence, especially regarding the 2003 Iraq War. They call it the most dramatic example.
Yes, the assertion is quite bold. They claim the lobby was the principal driving force behind the decision to invade, calling it a necessary but not sufficient condition.
A necessary condition, meaning it might not have happened without that push. How did that work, according to the sources?
Well, the mechanism described centers on key neoconservative figures in Washington at the time. Names like Douglas Faith, Richard Pearl come up. They strongly advocated for regime change in Iraq.
And this was seen as beneficial to Israel.
It was framed as an important Israeli strategic objective, yes. Something actually formalized in that 1996 Clean Break study, which was drafted for Benjamin Netanyahu. It basically advised Israel to improve its security by encouraging regime change in nearby rival states like Iraq.
So the argument is, the goal was removing a potential threat to Israel. And that goal got translated into U.S. policy through these influential players.
That's the case they make. And they note that top Israeli officials Sharon Netanyahu Barak were enthusiastically and publicly calling for the U.S. to topple Saddam Hussein, arguing Iraq was a grave threat.
And this perceived influence wasn't just about starting conflicts, right? The sources say it was also effective in shutting down peace efforts that didn't align with Israeli policy.
That's another major point. They detail what they call the humiliation of Secretary of State Colin Powell's peace mission in 2002 during Israel's Operation Defensive Shield. Powell was apparently trying to push for a more even-handed policy.
But he ran into opposition.
He faced immediate and intense domestic pressure, according to the account. He was undercut by neoconservative columnists, by AI PAC-backed rallies, by congressional resolutions affirming strong support for Israel's military actions.
And the outcome.
The result, the sources conclude, was that U.S. and Israeli rhetoric basically merged. They even cite a Washington Post headline from the time that summed it up. Bush and Sharon nearly identical on Mideast policy.
Wow. The takeaway seems to be that it's incredibly difficult to steer Washington policy away from that established consensus, regardless of who is Secretary of State.
That's the picture painted.
Okay, so beyond strategy, the sources then turn to the moral case, the justification for this unique relationship. For decades, a big part of that was the idea of the U.S. backing a small, weak, besieged state, the whole underdog narrative.
Right. And that idea gets strongly challenged in the historical analysis we reviewed. The sources lean heavily on what's called the new history by Israeli scholars, like Benny Morris.
What did Morris say?
He apparently called the belief that the Zionists were badly outnumbered in the 1948 war one of the most tenacious myths. The sources argue that actually Israel held advantages in both manpower and firepower during that conflict.
So that narrative of existential peril, at least in 1948, is questioned historically. And the material also argues that today, Israel's military strength makes it, quote, more secure than it has ever been, at least within its 1967 borders.
Correct. Which, in their view, kind of dismantles the underdog argument for needing such massive unconditional support now.
Okay, so if the underdog argument is shaky, what about the other main moral pillar, the shared democracy argument?
Critique here focuses on the fact that Israel was explicitly founded not just as a state, but specifically as a Jewish state.
And according to the sources, this commitment to being a Jewish state has real consequences for non-Jewish citizens, particularly Israeli Arabs.
Precisely. They cite, for instance, a 2003 Israeli government commission that found official behavior toward Israeli Arabs was neglectful and discriminatory.
And there was poll data mentioned, too.
Yes. Strikingly, a 2007 poll cited showed that 55% of Israeli Jews actually favored segregated entertainment facilities for Jews and Arabs.
Over half favored segregation in entertainment.
That's what the poll data indicated, according to the sources. And they use this to argue that there's a widespread support for unequal treatment, which challenges the claim of Israel being a fully liberal, inclusive democracy in the Western sense.
And then there's the founding of the state itself. The new historians are brought up again.
Yes, their work is cited to claim that the creation of Israel in 1948 involved explicit acts of ethnic cleansing. This leads to what the analysts frame as the core moral tension.
Which is?
That while past crimes against Jews absolutely justify supporting Israel's existence, the sources claim Israel's own actions against Palestinians undermine its claim to special treatment and unconditional U.S. support.
And the argument is that the domestic political situation, the power of the lobby, prevents a real public debate in the U.S. about these moral complexities, even with this historical scholarship out there.
That seems to be the implication, that the consensus makes it very difficult to have that kind of open discussion about America's moral standing globally in relation to this policy.
So, after laying all this out, what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've covered a relationship defined by just immense U.S. support, both financial and diplomatic, and also deep political entrenchment here in the U.S. A dynamic that, according to the sources we examined, often runs directly counter to what might be considered U.S. strategic interests, particularly in the Middle East.
Right, and the conclusion drawn in the material isn't just a critique. They do suggest potential pathways for change. The focus is often on structural fixes that could, theoretically, lessen the lobby's influence and allow the U.S. more flexibility in pursuing its foreign policy goals.
Like what kind of fixes?
Well, one idea floated is public financing of elections. The thinking is that would weaken the direct financial link between lobby groups, including this one, and elected officials. Another avenue mentioned involves the possibility of American Jewish organizations themselves shifting their agendas, maybe reflecting what some see as growing unease with hardline policies within parts of the community.
Interesting. Which brings us to our final thought for you today. The sources argue pretty pointedly that if the U.S. really wanted to tackle big strategic issues, Iran, Syria, peace between Israelis and Palestinians, the path, they claim, runs through Jerusalem, meaning U.S. policy towards Israel is key.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you to consider. The U.S. often talks about shifting towards a grand strategy of offshore balancing, basically, reducing its direct military footprint overseas and relying more on regional allies to maintain stability.
Mm-hmm.
But can the U.S. ever really pursue that strategy effectively if it requires putting serious pressure on Israel, pressure to make tough concessions for peace, maybe returning the Golan Heights to Syria, or facilitating a truly viable Palestinian state? Can that happen if it means confronting the very powerful, deeply entrenched political consensus in Washington that, according to these sources, the lobby has worked so hard to build and maintain?
That's the central dilemma highlighted.
Something to think about.